Hey everybody, hope everybody's doing well. Happy, just give me 1 second here. Let me change this real quick. All right, cool. Hope everybody's doing well. Happy Thursday. Hope you're all having a good week so far. Keeping busy, keeping occupied with different things. So today I got a real special guest. This gentleman is he's well known in the industry. He's highly regarded. He's a pedal builder, and his name is David Barber, and he was kind enough to come on. And so, without further ado, I would like to bring on Mr. David Barber. How are you, sir?
Hey, I'm doing well. How are you?
Not too bad, man. We talk about cutting it close.
Yeah.
You're giving me a coronary there. Before we get going here, let me. We got a whole bunch of people already lined up, so let me just say hello to the people in the chat. Bruce went in. Hey, Bruce, how are you? There's Six String Brian. Welcome. Great Fanzini. Nice to see you. Quentin James is in here. Let's go on. Here's a new name for the channel. One Boogie Boy. Okay. Welcome to the channel. BC Rich 581 is here. Fruitcake Tony, welcome. Daniel Horsley is here. BB May, Jason Metahavoc. Why not? Original Paramutant. Welcome, everybody. JP Page 2, and there's the first jump of the day. Jeff Miller, Ivan Carter, Blackjack Guitar Nut, Paul Ewing, Stephen S. There's my buddy Don, 2 3/4 Jams. Mark Taylor is here. There's another new name, Ronnie Santameyer. Welcome to the channel. Dale Palmer is here. Dennis Brio, and Thrash is here. All right. I want to welcome all you folks for checking in. And if you have any questions, just tag me in the chat, and then I'll forward them to David. So, David, how you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Not too bad. I was looking forward to this show. I know there's a lot of interest, so hopefully we're going to get some good questions as we go on here. So, usually the way I do these things, I kind of go in chronological order. So, I want to go back in time a little bit and sort of get the idea sort of where you come from musically, what got you into playing and all that sort of thing. So, and then we'll get to the pedals and all that kind of stuff, but it's always cool to hear the history of how, folks get involved with this music thing. Right. So,
yeah.
So going back, so what was the either artist or person that, or musical genre that kind of got you involved and made you want to play music in the first place?
Well, I was born in 1964, so it was pretty easy to get hit by the Beatles and by Motown. By the time I was around, I guess, 6 years old, there was Elton John.
Right.
So there was a lot of things happening at that time, and there had already been a lot of music previous to my entrance into this world that was always just on the radio. And I liked music from the time I was just a really little kid. So it was always there. But the Beatles was the main thing, like it is for so many other people. It was just, kind of an overwhelming sound.
So the Beatles, that's what you decided. Hey, you know what? I want to play. I want to learn how to play these songs. So that,
to a degree, it wasn't guitar first. I played drums for about the first 7 or 8 years.
Oh, okay.
I played music. When I was 8 years old, my parents got me a snare drum, and I got a 250 electronics projects in one kit from Radio Shack. And it had these little springs on it, and and a bunch of wires, and you could rewire these components that they gave you into all these different circuits. You could make a bug and leave it in a room so you could monitor what people were saying. You could make a little radio. You could make an oscillator that made a bunch of noise and stuff like that. And so pretty early on, that hobby of electronics was there, and seeing how it worked, was just kind of staring me in the face. And that was a pretty common hobby for a 7 or 8 year old kid to have back in 1971 or 2. Electronics. There was back when Lafayette was around, Heathkit was around, Dynaco was around. There was all these.
We have similar backgrounds. I'm an electronics guy too.
Oh, cool.
We can geek out later on if you want. Yeah. So you started playing drums early on. So what made you switch from drums to guitar?
Yeah, when I was in high school, I started becoming more exposed to actual guitars. I hadn't been around a lot of friends that had them. So one of my friends who also played drums, his dad had a guitar, And so I'd go over to the case and hit a few of the strings and think, oh my God, that sounds amazing, kind of thing. And I had heard Elliot Easton from the Cars.
Oh man.
So the Cars had just hit, and I was like, really new sound. I thought it was really cool.
Yeah.
Tom Petty was just hitting. Queen was one of my favorite groups at the time. So Brian May, and little did I know that Brian May is like one of the most elusive guitar tones you could try to get. I just knew that those things were exciting.
Yeah.
Keith Richards from the Rolling Stone. For some reason, somewhere around my early high school years, I started to kind of really get deeper into the Stones. I knew a lot of their songs, but now I wanted to play them. And so I got a guitar just so I could jam with my drum buddies.
Right.
And in less than a year, it just took over. And within 2 years, I'd sold my drum set or traded my drum set for a PVT 60.
Cool.
And that was my first electric guitar that I had. But the first guitar that I ever got a chance to play belonged to one of my buddy's fathers. And he wanted to get his son a snare drum that I had. I had a Ludwig Superphonic snare drum.
Right.
And he traded me that guitar. The first guitar I ever touched was a Gibson LGO, like very early 60s, late 50s LGO that I still have to this day. And that's where I learned to play guitar. I was lucky enough to start on a Gibson.
Yeah, that's great. I mean,
yeah.
My first guitar was sitting in a closet that nobody wanted at a friend's house, and that strings are like 3 inches off the fretboard. So that's pretty good.
And that's the typical story. It's amazing that we don't all start playing slide, because it would make sense with the high action we all have when we start. But I was so desperate for an electric guitar and couldn't afford one that I took a cheap microphone, threw it inside the sound hole, plugged it into a Sony reel-to-reel machine, cranked it up all the way, and instant distortion. I thought it sounded just like the Rolling Stones, but it turns out it didn't.
Yeah, I did the same thing into a little portable radio.
Yeah,
that picks up pretty easily.
Yeah,
that's cool. That's cool. So then I'm imagining at some point you started playing in bands. And did you gig around as well when you were younger?
Yeah, well, I ended up getting that T60 about a couple years after I started playing guitar, probably about a year and a half, 2 years, and I was right into bands right away. I mean, that was definitely the thought. You get the guitar, you play in the talent show band, at school, and then you form a band with your friends, and you're quite positive you're going to make millions of dollars on the next song that you write when you're 16 or 15 years old. And so, I ended up playing in bands for quite some time, played a lot of different types of music. I started off trying to play, the first stuff, of course, was kind of blues and blues-oriented rock, because that's what a kid can play.
Right.
Pretty early on, I ran into a good friend, or somebody who became a good friend, who's a keyboard player, who kept saying, we got to listen to jazz. We got to learn how to play jazz.
Oh,
and almost forcing it on me, because my headspace was still like Queen, Beatles, the Cars, and he was like, I've heard of something called Miles Davis. I've heard of this guy named John Coltrane.
Oh, man.
And, so my bridge to that was like the Dixie Dregs, like Steve Morse.
Right.
It was kind of like jazz ideas, but in a rock format. And so we started trying to play fusion at that time, and got to the point where we could kind of play like a rock style that had jazz influenced ideas. I ended up going to Peabody Conservatory in Baltimore, which is part of the Johns Hopkins University, and they have a very good music school.
Okay.
And I went to their prep for a couple of years and studied jazz and classical while I was still in high school. And so I ended up having a pretty good, foundation to work with, to be able to kind of pursue guitar as something where I understood music.
Right.
Not just, I knew where some things were on the guitar. And so that allowed me to play, a lot of different types of music in bands, and that led to failure. So, I'll let you ask the next question, because I have a tendency to keep talking.
Oh, keep going. I mean, because one of the things I was going to ask you was like, are you a schooled player? And you just kind of answer that question. So you studied it seriously, which, a lot of folks don't usually, either they don't have the opportunity to, or, they don't see their career path being music. And so they figure they'll do other stuff and do this as a hobby. So early on, it seems to me like you were on this path.
Yeah, my mother really wanted to. My mom was a college professor, so the idea of if I wanted to pursue music and I was so driven, she thought you should get as educated about this as you can. And I'm a horrible student. I mean, I just can't stand in front of another person, have them tell me ideas that I don't, of information that I don't currently have a burning desire to know. Like when I was being taught theory, there was nothing saying to me, you really need to know what two major tetrachords are separated by a whole step. But, you know, there it was. That's the way it, you know, kind of works. Somebody teaches you a major scale that way.
Right.
And so it took me a while, you know, to understand how to apply it. I never had a desire to be a great student. So while I learned it, while I was there in the school, learning has been something like it is for most musicians. You just continue to do that a little bit more. And I always do it at the pace that I need it. If I need to figure out how to play over a 2-5-1 progression, well, then I go, okay, now I need to know how to recognize a 2-5-1 when I see one in music. And I need to know what scales I can use over a 2-5-1, you know?
Right. So, I mean, with that kind of, when you were performing with bands with that kind of background, I'm thinking like when you were mentioning fusion, you were playing your own material, or you were doing like?
Yeah, I was doing a lot of my own material, but you know, the fusion stuff led to me playing fast, and playing fast in the '80s led to me playing in a heavy metal band.
That's kind of,
you know, because that's kind of the common path. You look at somebody like Steve Vai, who could have been, you know, world's greatest fusion guitar player, but as soon as he's got, you know, David Lee Roth and a bunch of other guys dangling big dollars and girls in front of him, he's like, hey, fusion can wait, you know?
Yeah. So while all this is going on, this is obviously developing your ear as well, because you're probably working with all different kinds of, at this point, I'm thinking different guitars, different amps, different that. You're kind of developing the ear for tone at this point. I would imagine that was all going on at the same time, correct?
It was, and the fact that when I was 18 years old, I got a gig at a music store that was a vintage guitar shop, one of the earlier vintage guitar shops I knew of, named Guitar Exchange in Catonsville, Maryland, working for a guy named Bruce Sandler. And he had all the cool stuff. I mean, there I was 18 years old, I'm in a shop, and it's got, you know, 52 Telecasters, 57 Stratocasters,
wow,
you know, Tweed basements, and eventually that stuff needed to be fixed. And the repair guys would only come around about once a week and pick stuff up. They'd keep it for 2 or 3 weeks and bring it back. And I had an electronics background, and I always could fix things. If you put something in front of me, I could figure out how to fix it without breaking it. I got all the breaking stuff out of the way when I was really young.
Right.
You know, at home, I broke all my parents' stuff. But so later on, I worked in music stores from 1983 or so up until about 1983 to about 1996 or so. I worked in music shops as a repair guy, as a salesman. So I was always around those guitars, to answer your question.
Right.
I've known what old Telecasters, I've known what a bunch of old 50s Tellies sound like all next to each other since I was, you know, 18 or 20 years old. Same with Strat, same with old Les Pauls. You know, so I was really informed as to what those were. Now, working in a music store for $3.25 an hour minimum wage back in, you know, 1983, I couldn't afford any of those cool guitars. So I would wait for the stuff to come in the door that needed massive repair, and I'd ask the guy who owned the store if he wasn't going to give the guy an offer on that used guitar that was in pieces, could I buy it? You know, and that's what became my guitars. I bought a lot of part stuff.
So we got a couple of things. First of all, it's 2 and 3 chord jams. Don, how are you? Don, I guess Don was, you were brought up in the same neck of the woods as Don, because he was saying the guitar store you just mentioned, he said he could walk to that store.
Huh.
So he's in the same neighborhood. And Visual Guy, welcome Visual Guy, says, cool show hack. David makes killer gear. I've owned the Gain Changer like 3 times.
Like fourth time is a charm.
Just keeps coming back to it. So the electronics thing, so the music thing you were schooled in, but the electronics thing was just, that was kind of your hobby that turned into more so later on.
I took electronics classes in high school because it was almost mandatory.
Right.
In the 80s. It's not anymore. It's a weird world we live in. Everything's electronic in our house, but they don't teach people that go to school anything about what's inside any of those electronic boxes. People don't know what a capacitor or resistor is anymore.
No.
And my dad, who had been primarily involved with chemicals when he was young. He was kind of a chemist that was untrained, but still at that time you didn't necessarily need to have a degree to do that kind of stuff. He had moved on to a place called ComSat Labs in Damascus, Maryland. And so he was developing substrates and basically the equivalent of PC boards for satellites when I was a little kid. So electronics was a little bit of the language of the house. And again, you know, in the 70s, in the late 60s, you know, your dad fixed stuff, or a lot of them did at least. You know, on the weekends, all the dads were out in front. They all had the hoods on their cars open. They were all trading back and forth the stuff to do the timing and everything else. So, you know, I'd see the electronics of a car. I never had anything beyond high school as far as formal training in electricity and electronics. And it was kind of the same deal. When I needed to find out, you know, how a JFET worked because something had a JFET in it, well, I'd go download the data sheet. Well, I couldn't download it at first. At first, you just got a military manual and that stuff at the library or at a used bookstore. But now you can just download it. But yeah, back in those days, I think I learned a lot of electronics beyond what I figured out from that Radio Shack kit and what my dad taught me, and from what I was able to learn in school, and then moved on to just whenever I could get a book on electronics, which there was a lot at the library. I would go to Hamfests. And Hamfest, you could pick up all kinds of old books, and you talk to all these old guys that learned electronics in the military. And they tended to learn electronics in a really cool way, like it was being taught to them so that they could survive. And so they kind of taught them all these bomb-proof ways of, like, you know, troubleshooting a circuit, of understanding how things work so that they don't become overly complicated. You know, just understanding, you know, I think it was at a Hamfest that somebody explained to me what the getter flashing did inside of a tube. You know, and so, and tubes were a big part of what I worked on. From even though I would fix things that were solid state, I wasn't that interested in solid state electronics when I was really young. Other than if something broke, I would just figure out what transistor or chip what didn't work right, or capacitor or whatever, and fix it. But I always worked with tubes, and I was always interested in tubes and amplifiers up until like the mid '90s. And it was somewhere around the mid '90s that I wanted to be able to build mic preamps for recording. I wanted to be able to build some things for my guitar, some pedals. I really just kind of stumbled into guitar building. Guitar pedal building. I had no idea anyone did that it could be a profession. I thought that was strictly for Boss and Ibanez, and I assumed there was something the equivalent of the Borg from Star Trek that was kind of like just churning out these pedal ideas. I didn't know that there was people behind them.
Right.
You know?
So Don is asking, did Dave know Steve Lafayette of Lafayette Electronics?
No, I didn't, but I bought a lot of stuff from him, I guess.
Well, there you go.
There was a Lafayette really close to my house, and so I'd go up there, and whenever I could afford a kit, I'd buy a kit.
Cool. So the thing is, so you have the electronics, and then you've got the musical background. And then there's that thing where now you have to marry the two, where you have the experience, or you understand the relationship between this circuit and how that circuit is going to sound when I put these components together. You know what I'm saying? That marriage of the two.
Yeah. So that's something, because I learned kind of slowly and empirically over a long period of time, there became kind of this intrinsic feel of, okay, you know, I can do all the math, but there's only so many values of capacitor that I can buy. I can do all the math, but there's only so many values of resistors you can buy without doing things like putting resistors in parallel, using precision resistors. You know, there's other things you can do to get around the fact to make the math work perfectly, but we're not trying to enter the atmosphere of Mars with pedals. We have to get into the basic ballpark, because there's no reference guitar, there's no reference pickups, there's no reference speakers, there's no reference EQ on any of those things. There's no reference room to work with. So with guitar, no matter how perfect you get it in your own environment, once you release it to the world, it's going to be used the way that they want it to be used. A Fender Bassman is the perfect example. It's a bass amp, and who plays them? Guitar players. I mean, yeah, bass players do use them a little bit, but primarily it's guitar players' thing. When it came to dealing with what I could do with electronics, some of it was dictated by, what parts, were there, and being able to just go straight to my box of parts and plugging things in and saying, this is what'll have to work, or no, that doesn't work, and I need to find another way.
Right, right. So, okay, so as far as the the two coming together, you were mentioning that you were fixing stuff. Basically, you're a repair guy. When did you start getting away from the repair guy and actually creating your own products?
Well, along with repairing things came modifying things, and those were essentially mine. So I was modifying Marshalls. I was working with Paul Smith from Paul Reed Smith Guitars in around 88 to 90. He was developing his first solid state guitar amp, and he was modifying Marshalls on the side, I guess to kind of finance it, or just to really be able to work with guitar players and get their ideas on amplification. And so I was going down to his shop about once a week at one point, and we'd spend time modifying amps, and then I'd meet with him out on a gig, and we'd talk about the amps that we worked on and what his amp sounded like that night on the gig. And working next to him and listening to Paul talk about it, and knowing that Paul was not a pure electronics guy, that he was a guitar guy who would get himself shocked every 10 minutes in front of me while trying to put parts in a live amplifier. I thought I was going to watch Paul Smith get himself killed a few times because he'd get bitten by things in a live amp. And it made me feel like I need to go at this a little bit more. I need to not be afraid to like develop my own stuff. Because I was just watching him doing it in front of me, and I thought that's something I can, that I think I feel comfortable with, although in a little bit safer way probably than Paul approached it, because he'd just get an idea and have to hear it right away. And so I started more and more modifying things to what I wanted to hear. I went out on tour with a band called Danzig for a while because John, the guitar player, was a good friend of mine from Baltimore. And so we modified his amps a little bit, and that got me kind of encouraged a little bit more. And I came back to Baltimore after that tour, and again, found myself modifying more and more equipment, working more and more on Fenders. And that was when turning Silverface amps into Blackface amps, became a thing. And then I started telling guys just to bring me broken amps. I would say, go out and buy just an amp that's got transformers and a chassis and a cabinet, and I'll make a cool amp inside it. You can buy that. You can buy a dead amp for $50 back then from Fender or from Marshall.
Right.
And then I turned into something cool. And then my buddy Jeff Barber from Buddha Amplification, he wasn't Buddha Amplification at that time. He was called Precision Audio Tailoring at that time in Baltimore, and he just modified and repaired equipment. He had gotten a deal to make 50 amps for a company called Fenton Music Group. And Fenton Music Group was out of Washington, like kind of around Veers Mill, where Chuck Levin's music is, Washington Music Center. And they were a big supplier of Tweed for that early kind of resurgence of Tweed amplification and Tweed products. And so they wanted to have their own amp. So Jeff came up with a little amp for them that was kind of like an EL84 version of like something like a Tweed Deluxe. It was a similar size. And he needed somebody to build about 50 of those. So I built 50 of those amps for Jeff. And then out of that, he got a chance to work with a French distributor who wanted a slightly different amp. And he built that. It didn't go over in France, but he made a connection to one of the guys that used to be marketing at Mesa Boogie. And they formed Buddha Amplification. And I built the first 50 Buddha amplifiers, the Twin Masters, I think they were called Twin Master 15 or something like that. Okay. And then Ronnie Santmeyer, who checked in in the comment section earlier, took over building those. And Ronnie continues to build with me. He builds our custom shop stuff. So that led into me designing more and more amplifiers and modifying amplifiers. And I guess the next question is, how do I end up designing a pedal?
Well, I was gonna go back a little bit when you're modding amplifiers. So are you looking at? I'm gonna go a little geek on you, but for you it's not geeking. But for probably most people, so are you looking like at a schematic? Do you have are the schematics available, or are you just opening it up and like just tracing everything out? From experience, you kind of know where everything goes.
It's both. So I learned how to trace things pretty early on because I couldn't get schematics. We obviously no internet. When I started working in music stores, I could get schematics then because you could say, hey, I work at this store, and they would say, oh, we'll send you out the pack for that store, and they'd send you a big book of schematics sometimes if you were lucky, or I'd find somebody that had one. I was friends with a guy who still has a business called Angela Instruments, and Steve over at Angela Instruments had books of schematics that he would loan me. And so he lent me some books, and I learned a ton from those. And I would make copies at the library of those schematics. And then there was the Groove Tubes book, had a bunch of schematics for Fender amps and that. I remember I used that. And then in the early 90s, I used to do guitar shows. And I went to a guitar show, and I remember Gerald Weber had his hip guide to guitar amplifiers, and that had a whole bunch of nice layouts of schematics, and then the physical layout of like all of the Fender amps, and that was pretty cool. And Angela Instruments also had something called like the Angela Pages or Angela something or other, and they had Ken Fisher from Trainwreck doing early articles on like amplification in there. So there's been a lot along the way, and I mean the internet was obviously the big explosion.
Right.
When I say explosion, it took a while for it to have pictures and stuff, so we could actually see schematics. So the early days, it was hanging out on something called Ampage. That was like 1998 or 9, somewhere around there. That site was around, and I would, then you could actually pass schematics back and forth. But yeah.
So you're looking at, you're tracing, or you have the schematic for a thing, and then so when you're modding the amp, you're just looking at, I'm just going to change a couple of components.
Well, you draw from what you've seen. Whenever you look at a schematic, it's pretty rare that you see something completely new. A lot of this stuff comes out of application guides and application manuals. So So sometimes I'll see something in a guitar amp in a preamp section that I'd only ever seen done before as some sort of a driver in like a phase inverter and some kind of a hi-fi amp or something. But I'll recognize that audio circuit and say, oh, that's cool. And then eventually you do the same thing yourself. You realize, there's different ways to skin a cat that you can apply. You can have grid fed, you can have cathode fed, you can have a lot of different ways of approaching a triode. And make those things perform differently or perform different functions, or even make them do something kind of idiosyncratic on purpose. And some of it's experimentation, some of it's too, somewhere between blowing things up and making something cool. But, so there's a combination of experimentation of what you've seen in other devices.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. It's interesting. Oh, thank you so much, Miss Southern Belle, for the super chat. Appreciate that. So, it's funny that you started with the amps and then you went to pedals, because I've had other people on that were pedal folks, and they have the same thing. They started with the amps and then they went to the pedals. It almost seems like it's a natural progression to go from the amps to the pedals.
Well, for me, in the mid 90s or up to the mid 90s, you tried to get everything done with only a few pedals that really worked well live. So those things would be like tube screamers and things like that. I hope that noise isn't driving you nuts.
I don't know what that is.
Okay. It's on my end.
Oh, okay.
It turns out I have friends and they message each other. Who knew? So I was trying to basically solve the not wanting to bring 2 overdrive pedals to get a sound that could be done with one. Like if you wanted to play Voodoo Child and you didn't want to crank your amp up, one tube screamer wasn't enough unless you wanted to do a pretty laid back version. Mm-hmm. So a lot of guys carried 2 tube screamers, or they do the fuzz face in a tube screamer trip. And I was just thinking for myself, because I was gigging, I want to get a cool overdrive pedal. And I'd seen Ken Fisher from Trainwreck say great things about a pedal called a Klon in the mid 90s.
Right.
And I thought, maybe I'll order one of them. And then I saw the price and I was like, wow.
Yeah.
That thing's like $175 or $200. I can't remember what it was, but I called Bill Finnegan and he was super nice. And I thought, I'm going to order one. And I ordered it. And like 2 or 3 days later, I realized, man, rent's going to be really tight this month. And hence is the life of a studio engineer and a recording and a repair guy and a music teacher. I was doing a lot of different things at once at the time.
Okay.
And so I thought, I probably should see if I can just build something that solves the problems that I have with the overdrive pedals that are current.
Right.
I do everything else. I just wasn't doing a lot of designing with solid state equipment, to be honest with you. I just didn't goof around with op amps much or transistors, and I just didn't have a feel for them at the time, and I didn't realize how closely related they were as far as getting them set up to tubes. And I felt totally comfortable with tubes. It just, I saw, you'd see a chip and you're like, why so many terminals?
things
I
in there.
never did, but still, I didn't know what to expect from it as much, other than just what I've been doing with repair work at the time. And so I called back Bill and I canceled the Klon. I should have bought it and resold it 10 years later.
Yeah, I was going to say there's some money now. Yeah.
Yeah. So and just built my own thing. So I started with just reverse engineering a TS10 that I had, getting rid of the buffers. I think it had one extra transistor on top of that it didn't really need. I got rid of that. And I realized that the drive pot was really small. And so I made a switchable chain. I put a one meg drive pod on it, so it had a lot more range. You could go higher. And then I realized that the way it was, the op amp was set up, it wasn't going for the maximum gain you could get for it. So I set up a boost switch to get the maximum gain, of course. And still the same frequency response, basically. And I did a little bit to trim off the mids, and that I took out on gigs with me and started gigging with it. It was in a pretty flimsy box, and I lent it to some of my guitar playing friends, because when I was gigging, if my friends were there, they'd come up and they'd be like, "So what's that box, and why does it sound so good when you step on it?" And I'd say, "Well, it's just me goofing off with a circuit."
Right.
And so a few guys asked me if I would build them, for friends of mine. And so I was like, yeah, that'll help me pay rent. So I made a couple of them for some friends. And then when they gigged with them, more people, asked them on their set break, what's that thing you're stepping on? And so they'd send them my way. And before I knew it, somebody who bought one from me talked about it on the internet. And I didn't know anything really of the internet much then. My parents had an internet connection, but I didn't have a computer in 1997. And the next thing you know, I started getting phone calls from a lot further away than Baltimore, Maryland, where I started. People were calling me from Alabama, and I thought that was kind of far away for somebody to know who I was. And then a guy called me from Australia and called me mate a bunch of times and said cheers a whole lot. And I thought, man, how could this even be happening? How could this guy know who I am?
Yeah.
And I asked him, and he said, it's the internet, mate. And so I thought, I got to get me one of these internets. Yeah. So I bought a computer. And that's when I started, figuring out that people would want them, that there was a little bit of a market for that kind of stuff. It was pretty small at that time.
Yeah, 97, yeah.
And then, the calls just kept coming. And so that original pedal that I made, we called the Tone Pump. And I never thought I was going to make many of them. I thought maybe I would make 10 or 15 if I was lucky, and it would just help me pay rent for a year.
Right.
And so when people started calling, because it was based on a tube screamer, and I thought, well, there can't be any market in a souped up tube screamer. That's crazy. So I changed it. First thing I did was I made the Tone Pump into a different circuit than what I'd become known for. And fortunately, people really liked it. If I had only known, that tube screamers would be what everyone made. But I didn't know. I had no idea.
So there's a question going back to what we were talking about a little bit before. Does David have any stories with Gerald Weber he can elaborate on? Gerald's early books were quite a resource. It's BB Made. He's also a guitar builder. So,
I think I met Gerald at a guitar show briefly one time. We never talked on the phone. Jeff from Budo used to talk to Gerald and knew Gerald, but I didn't really have any communication. All I know is that his book was useful. It was a very opinionated book. It's a controversial book to some extent. Some people, don't necessarily. Some people feel like what's in the book is there to also sell Kendrick products. And maybe it is, but you certainly, for me, it was the schematics that mattered and some of the stories about some of those different products that I thought were cool. It was kind of a neat thing for that book.
So Crowbar's saying, David Barber, talked to you back in 2002 before I bought one of the early direct drives after seeing a Guitar Player magazine editor's pick review.
Yep.
Thanks for the great conversation. So that's going back a while.
Thank you.
Yeah. Folks, if you have questions for David as we go, please tag me in the chat, and I will forward those questions to David. So tag me at Guitar Hack, please, and then I'll be able to see those. So you started out, what? It's funny because that's the whole thing. Everybody's, I modded a tube screamer. It's either that or one of the Boss pedals. It seems to be like the first sort of go-to pedal that you mod. I guess because the circuits are relatively simple, You know?
Well, it was actually because it was so ubiquitous. It was because it was what I was trying to get through gigs with. It's because it's what my friends were trying to get through gigs
Right.
with. And it was the best sounding thing with a Fender amp at the time. You know, I mean, a Rat worked better, I thought, with a Marshall, the early ones, because the Marshall kind of rounded off those jagged edges that the Rat had. I'm sure other people feel differently, but that's how I felt with my playing. Um, so the Tube Screamer was at least in the ballpark. That was really what drove me to it. Not because I didn't know if it was simple or not. I didn't consider any of the stuff all that complicated. I mean, to me, the worst part of a tube amp is that it weighs 90 pounds. You know, that's the complication there. You know, even though back then I was younger and I didn't mind that so much, but you know, with picking an overdrive pedal to start modifying at that time, or to kind of redo, it just was in the ballpark. And I looked at it and realized there was more gain to be had, that the mid-range didn't have to be so prominent, and that the low end could be recovered. And so, you know, I ended up probably making, I don't know, maybe 25, 30 of those, you know, early ones, maybe 50. I don't think I quite made 100 of them. I doubt it. Probably, you know, 25 to 50, somewhere in that ballpark before we may have called them the Tone Pump 2 when I changed them. I can't remember that early part of the history as well, but we changed them by sometime in 98. And that's also when I came out with the Burn Unit, was in 98.
Yeah, so I was going to ask you, what was the first pedal that, well, I guess the Tone Pump 2, because you created that second circuit on your own. But
yeah.
what was the one, I guess the one after that?
That was the Burn Unit.
The Burn Unit, okay. Because Visual Guy's asking, he'd like to hear your explanation on your current offerings, and we'll go through all the pedals. But let's start with the Burn Unit. So can you tell us a little bit about pedal number 2?
So the Burn Unit, a lot of that came about because I was borrowing a friend of mine's. He had a Dumble Overdrive Special that was it needed a repair, so it would come to me for a repair, but I also had a recording studio at the time. And so it got to live there for a little while. Mm-hmm. And so I had a Dumble to play with for probably close to 9 months, maybe a year, after I fixed the problem that it had. It was a minor potentiometer issue, but it was really expensive to send it back to Alexander in California just to get a pot fixed.
Right.
So I was trying to make that sound because in looking at that amp, and of course I had to look at it, I realized, a lot of it from the preamp, beyond the preamp, I should say, was pretty Fender playbook, mm-hmm. kind of thing. And I was like, it's just not different enough from a Twin or a Showman to think that that's where the magic's happening. I mean, there's some cool stuff in the power supply that helped it for sure, and good choices of power and output transformers. And even as a matter of fact, my friend that owns Guitar Exchange had a couple of Dumbles at his shop, and those actually had Fender iron on them. They had dual Showman output transformer and power transformer and choke too. So, I realized that the magic of the Dumble was in the preamp, and I thought, can I recreate those harmonics and that kind of architecture in a pedal, which is a pretty, out there thing to do on my second pedal I ever developed, and probably the first guy that ever tried to make a Dumble, pedal.
Pedal, yeah. And
so that's like early 98, mid 98. And, so I was able to have Fender amps in front of me that I could plug my Burn Unit into, mm-hmm. and then play the Dumble next to it. And I worked to the point where I felt like it was incredibly close. And all the guitar players that were coming to my studio or coming over for repairs, I'd have them play it. They all felt, kind of the same way. It was remarkably close at that time. So we put that out, and the Burn Unit just kind of instantly sold really well. And I don't think I really marketed it so much as like a Dumble pedal, because I didn't know how you could use that name. I didn't know if I could say Dumble. I think the only thing I did was put in the manual some different suggested sounds, and one of the sounds was $15,000 dumbbell sound. Not at all saying that Alexander's a dumbbell, but right. At that time it seemed like dumbbell money, and little did I know 15 grand would be a bargain.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it was just a way of making a play on words without having to worry about. I didn't want to hire a lawyer to find out whether I could say the name Dumble or not. So, I realize now that people can market them with controls that look almost identical to a Dumble and so forth, and that they can actually say his name. That we can all say Dumble together. Dumble, Dumble, Dumble. There we go. But yeah, but I also didn't know how many people would want to use the Dumble sound because it had been in my studio for around 9 months to a year, and every guitar player that came in that was recording, I'd say, "Hey man, you should check out this cool amp. It's called a Dumble." And they'd play through it through a moment and be like, "Nah, I'm going to use my Marshall." No kidding. Like a lot of guys came in and used a Marshall and a Rat or a Laney and a DS1 who were offered to use a Dumble. Lots of Mesas that got used instead of the Dumble. I mean, it probably would not happen now. People would use the Dumble just to say that they did.
Yeah, exactly.
But so I thought it wasn't necessarily everybody's cup of tea. I loved it, and I knew Robin Ford loved it. And it was a model made directly replicating the Talk to Your Daughter Robin Ford model. My friend Joe Amy, who ordered it from Alexander, had told him that's what he wanted. And somehow, I know we had heard all kinds of voodoo stories about getting in contact with Alexander and whether you actually got amps after you sent him money. But he had no problems at all. It went off like a regular purchase from anybody who was a custom builder, to be honest with you. So he must have really liked Joe, or maybe those stories were just a bunch of myths. But so the burn unit was also meant to be able to replicate other sounds. So it could do a really good tweed overdrive sound when it was set up low, and it could do kind of some cool Stevie Ray Vaughan type stuff, depending on, because there was a dynamics control on it. And that was kind of the secret to the sound of that.
Right.
The burn unit was the dynamics control kind of decided how it broke into distortion, and it was kind of a secondary distortion circuit that was meant to emulate how power tubes were working and how they were responding. At least that's how I thought of it in my mind. I was kind of balancing the way a tube amp, especially on something like a Dumble, moving all the way to tweed amps, the way each of them is doing one thing, like the power amp in a Dumble staying pretty clean the way most people use it. Even when you play it loud, it's 100 watts. It'll kill you.
Right.
Your drummer will be gone before you're out of headroom. Mm-hmm. So, that's a fairly, clean dynamic power amp with most of the cool, like harmonics and things being generated in the preamp. Whereas when you're getting distortion out of a tweed, it's the other way around. That, the preamps, is so simple. That first, triode is the same no matter where you set any of the knobs. There's nothing governing what comes into it. So you're more making the phase inverter and the power tubes fall apart on the tweed. So the dynamics control helped people to emulate that. And it's been popular for a long time. The only reason we're not making them right now is because it's been difficult to re-engineer it into a new enclosure that works well with compact formats.
Right. Here's my coffee delivery.
Oh, man. I just have water.
Thank you. At some point during my show, I will get and I'm Canadian, so it has to be a Tim Hortons coffee.
I don't know what Tim Horton is.
You don't know what Tim Hortons coffee is?
No.
It's like the biggest coffee chain in Canada. There's a joke where, there's so many of them around that, if you walk into a Tim Hortons, you'll probably find another Tim Hortons. Like, they're just everywhere. So anyway, I got a couple of questions. So Magic Matt is saying, David, he just acquired the DD version 4. I'm assuming that's a direct drive. Does the new early 4 input gain position come close to something you can get from the DDSS via the internal trim pots?
No, the DD, the direct drive version 4, DDV4, has that, what I call a 4-hole or 4-input mode. And that was really something where I thought about it for a long time that the direct drive could have had that feature. But I was doing some revoicing of the direct drive V3, which then led to a V3.1. And only a few weeks later to the V4, because I just got impatient, I guess. And I made a prototyping version, and the prototyping version ended up having that 4-hole input on it just for me to experiment with. I wasn't really thinking I was going to include it, and I couldn't stop playing it.
Right.
I was like, I can't believe how close I got to the sound of a 4-input, like anywhere from a Bassman to a JTM 45 to an early 4-input EL84 amp. I was pulling off Clapton sounds out of that box that I hadn't gotten out of any other boxes before. Wow. That real dynamic stuff. And I'm a real nut for like the Beano Bluesbreaker album, as a lot of people are, obviously. I mean, to me, that's kind of the wailing wall of guitar sound when you're talking about, you know, Les Paul and Marshall. Even though it's not an EL34 Marshall, it really, you know, Les Paul, you know, Marshall thing. And so it was just too cool not to include it. And to me, it's the closest thing I've been able to do, and that I've heard anybody do, with being able to create those kind of dynamics out of an op-amp based or transistor based, you know, pedal of any sort. It just really has that kind of. It doesn't feel so limited. Your ear doesn't tell you it's transistors, and that's, you know, what I'm always trying to work around is to keep pushing the circuit a little bit further. And a lot of the circuits that I work with, I started to develop them pretty early on. Like, they really are all born out of, for the most part, the burn unit and the LTD, I guess, which came a little bit later, and me constantly manipulating those circuits. That's a kind of a fun project for me, is how much further can I take this? How much further can I take this?
Right.
You know, and realizing that simple circuits can give you pretty complex things. You know, if you're, you know, willing to listen to the changes and reevaluate, and, you know, kind of keep throwing, you know, spitballs at the wall.
Right. And he's thanking for your answer, and he says the V4 is killer, giving the SS a run for its money, he's saying.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a different sound than an SS too. An SS is a little bit more rock. I think Ronnie Santmeyer, who logged in earlier, may have had a lot to do with encouraging me to do something like the SS and take it further. He's always liked kind of more aggressive, you know, pumped up, you know, rock sounds.
Right.
And he made those in the custom shop, which we call B Custom. And yeah, so it's kind of a different angle on it.
All right, so let's go. So burn unit was, and the burn unit, I guess they, like you were saying, they sold like hotcakes when you put them out. What was the next? So if we're just going chronological order, what was the next pedal in the chain?
The next pedal, I believe that was the Edge Hog. No, the Deep Fryer. The Deep Fryer was next. That was a bass overdrive. Okay. And so that was actually based off of the burn unit. We made those for about 5 or 6 years. And it was something that was supposed to get redesigned and continue to sell, but too many projects got in the way. It's coming back, though, and we can get enclosures again. Mm-hmm. And then I went to the Edge Hog, and the Edge Hog was a more aggressive sounding pedal. I didn't get a ton of traction with that. It didn't do poorly, but I thought I could approach that kind of a sound a little bit better, and we ended up making something later on. I don't know if you can see it.
Dirty Bomb. Yep.
Dirty Bomb.
Mm-hmm.
Man, that's a strong reflection. There we go.
Yeah, I see that.
So, and that handled aggressive guitar sounds a lot better, I thought, than the Edge Hog did. That had a back sandal EQ, the Dirty Bomb, and so it had a pretty cool and strong EQ. And that's what I'm always trying to make sure that I do, is that I give a lot of versatility in pedals, and that the EQ is powerful, but not so powerful that you get into so much trouble that there's only one small sweet spot, and the rest of it is hard to use. You see a lot of that in guitar pedals, though, where, you know, one end of the tone knob just sounds like mosquitoes mating, and the other end is like elephants walking through peanut butter. You know, it's just
Well, you mentioned the Rat pedal earlier, and that's one of those where it's just there's like one spot, and then that's it. Yeah. So there's pedals that you obviously you're not making everything all the time. You're starting a pedal and then you're moving on to something else. You're not producing everything all the time. So what makes you decide what kind of goes by the wayside? Is it you get ideas for new stuff that comes along and then you just literally you can't tool up for all these simultaneously? Or how does that decision?
That is hard. At one time we had 8 people in total working at Barber Electronics. Right now it's me, and really the other guys right now aren't doing anything. We don't have any enclosures to work with. I can't get them because of the pandemic. So, but yeah, it's a matter of customers and what they want. So, I'm always getting emails. I'm talking to people in forums, and they're influencing, what's going on. I can, kind of put my ear to the ground with that and see that people are saying, "Oh, I need pedals to be smaller." Everybody went smaller a while back, and
Everybody's many pedals. Yeah,
I don't love smaller. It achieves one thing: it makes the pedal board lighter, and it makes it, a kind of a smaller profile, obviously, but it doesn't leave you more room for control, and it doesn't leave you more room to use, as good a components as you want to. A big potentiometer with a, sturdy, steel parts will last longer than something that's made of plastic, with a, I'm trying not to say the word shaft on a channel being watched by a bunch of guys. So anyway, the cheap pods have a plastic shaft, as opposed to the metal pots that are like 24 millimeters.
right.
And the same thing with using good quality capacitors and things like that. When you're making things small, you can get good stuff. I don't want to say that you can't, but a more durable part sometimes has thicker leads, and so on. So. And I can put trim pots on the inside, which was always a penchant of mine, to give people more controls on the interior that allowed them to modify in the way that I would if they could bring the pedal back to me. Because, when I first started selling pedals, it was always the same thing. I like this, but can you make me one with more bass? I like this. Can you make me one with less mid-range, more gain? On and on. So I realized, pretty early, I was like, I can put trim pots in these things, and these guys can set them up to have more bass, less bass. Whatever, and it won't necessarily have to make the pedal bigger if I don't put those knobs on the top.
Right.
The only other option with putting all those knobs on the top is making the knobs come all the way down the foot switch. And then unless you're a thumb stomper, somebody who literally turns it, the pedal on and off with just your thumb, you can't do it with your foot anymore without accidentally turning knobs and breaking, toggle switches off. So there's always, life's a box of compromises.
Yeah. Well, yeah, there's always a trade-off. The mini pedals, the big thing, the mini pedals is people want more pedals in a smaller footprint. At least for me, that's my, that's why I love the mini pedals. It's like if there's a mini version of a full size pedal, it's like, oh great, that's going to take up less space on my board. That's I think the main thing. But like you said, if to do that, you are sacrificing something, right? Fewer features, for example. Or just, less. But if you just want the sort of the basic effect, you could probably squeeze that into a mini pedal. But if you want the versatility, then you have to go the full size, just because of the electronics and switching.
Yeah, and until pedal boards get a little bit better at making them stable, a lot of the small pedals are a little wobbly, and you have to have side-mounted jacks on the micro pedals, which as big as a phone jack is,
up all the space. Yeah,
it takes up all the space on the interior pedal. If you open the pedal up, it's like, well, it's all jacks.
It's all jack, yes.
Right. There's just not much room for a circuit. So I always kind of wished that with micro pedals there had been a new micro jack that came out. Something that allowed there to be a little bit more space on the interior. I'm sure somebody will do it at some point. The problem is anybody who does it, the next thing you know, they're going to want to either copyright it or get paid for a trademark or something where every other pedal builder is supposed to pay them. And that means it's going to fail.
Right.
The automatic thing is as soon as somebody says, hey, I've got a new concept, and everybody says, great. And they say, and you're going to pay me for it every time you use it. Then everybody goes, nah, forget it. And it's hard enough to get guitar players to switch out of everybody using 1/4-inch phone jacks. It's great for your guitar. It works great for your amp because those are big and they need sturdy connections. But the other end of that connection does not necessarily need to be, when you're using micro pedals, something that takes up all the space on the interior. So hopefully at some point, that'll happen. I've heard the Christopher Walken thing before.
Yeah, you're in the chat, right? All right. Well, let's talk about, and thanks, Bruce, for throwing up. So we're putting your links up, David, so you know, and I have a link if anyone is interested in David's pedals, I have a link to his website in the description, and Bruce just threw up a link as well. What are your, and I looked at your website, and I looked at some of the pedal reviews, the most recent ones that you have out, and I was kind of like, well, looking at what would interest me, and the pedal for me, hands down, is the direct drive. Hands down, that's where I would go. But what are your hottest or best sellers in the last, say, couple of years?
It's the main things that you see there. It's the Game Changer, the direct drive, and the tone press. Those are the big ones. So it's two different types of overdrive, and each of those overdrives has multiple types of overdrive basically built into them. So there's mode switches that allow the direct drive to really span the years of kind of big Marshall, and British style sounds, not AC 15 type sounds, but so when I say British, I mean kind of Marshall style sounds. That doesn't mean it's strictly Marshall sounds. You can use a direct drive and get a little bit of a cranked bassman sound to some extent. Maybe not quite as furry and ragged, but and then the Game Changer is just a whole lot of different modes based on more of the sound of like American amplifier breakup. So a lot of the way those blackface amps break up and things like that, they have more clarity. And to some degree, I wanted it to act the way you expect an op-amp based overdrive pedal to act. There's a certain amount of style of compression. There's a certain chord clarity that you get with op-amp based overdrive pedals that I think actually is, for a lot of type of gigs, preferable to tube breakup. You can just play more complex chords with a lot of IC based overdrives than you can with cranked up tube amps. With a crank up tube amp, you can get a 7, dominant 7 chord. You can squeak out a 9th kind of thing, but if you play a major 7 or a major 9, it's usually going to be pretty ugly, depending on what the amp is and how you have it set up, how the speaker's breaking up and things like that. But if you're playing through a pretty dynamic amplifier as your bass tone, so it actually plays clean, and you use a Game Changer into it, and you play dynamic chords, it's going to come through. It's going to work. It's not going to sound like, just kind of like, it's going to happen. And so that's an advantage that op amps have for creating distortion. Now, because they tend to have, and the thing that's happening with that is the harmonics of a tube amp are creating those big fat notes per note. When you're playing a single note, it sounds pretty gigantic with a good tube amp. But you get a lot of individual notes stacked up to make a complex chord, and they start throwing a lot of unrelated harmonics at each other. And then the next thing you know, you get something where a chord that sounds good clean doesn't work distorted. Whereas an op amp, you have a little bit more control over that, where it's a little bit difficult to get quite as fat as like a cranked tweed amp with an op amp based overdrive. But what that trade-off is, you can get real close, but still have that chord clarity that the tube amp, like a tweed, is just not going to give you. So for guys that like chords, guys that are playing a lot of dominant 7s, guys that are resolving things, and want to make sure that people hear the chord progression, an IC is sometimes preferable, or often preferable, I would say, for those types of sounds. So that's what the Game Changer really specializes in, is that kind of, clarity, even if you're using a lot of overdrive, even if you're using a lot of distortion from it.
So that brings up a question. You're talking about when you're testing pedals, like, because you were saying earlier, you don't know what the guy's going to use once he buys your pedal. What variety of amps are you trying? And are you trying like the sort of the, like, I'm going to try this with a Marshall, I'm going to try this with a Fender, I'm going to try this with a Mesa, and then to go along with that, like, what are your guitars like? To what extent are you kind of trying to imagine what the potential uses for that pedal are going to be out there?
Because there are no true reference, there isn't a reference guitar or a reference amp, I have to use a lot. So what you're thinking is exactly what I do. I have a Fender Deluxe Reverb reissue, because that's probably one of the most ubiquitous blackface style sounds you can buy today. And even though it would be neat to be able to use an original Deluxe, this sounds really close. And I've changed the speaker out and the tubes. but it's what everybody else has. They're more likely to play through a deluxe reverb reissue than they are the deluxe. And whatever sounds good through the deluxe reverb reissue will sound good through the original amplifier. And then I have a Vox AC15 C1, which is a kind of Vox-like sound. It says Vox on it. That's about as good as it gets for me. But it's ballparkish to what guys from an AC30 or AC15 might need. I don't love the amp, to be honest with you. You probably can tell. But I have an AC15 style amp that I built that I also use. And then I have a Marshall that I like a lot right now. I have an Origin 20 that I modified a little bit, which is, man, with one simple mod to that amp, it's great with pedals, way better than it is stock.
I have an Origin 50.
It might be the same mod, but they're a little shy on bass because they want you to crank the amp up and for it to stay really tight. But one simple mod, and you can use it at any volume level, and it sounds really dynamic and full. And so that's just the first cathode. The first cathode is set up with a 1 microfarad. That's all the way on the left-hand side of the board if you have the amp upside down and the pot's facing you.
Mm-hmm.
On the left-hand side of the board, there's a 1 microfarad cap, and if you change that out to something above 10 microfarads, and observe polarity, please, then the amp starts to sound a lot more dynamic. And of course, that's a mod for people who know what they're doing with electricity and so forth. And then I have a Marshall Class 5 that I use.
Right.
I have a Barber Echelon amplifier, which can sound like an awful lot of different amps. It can use nearly every octal socket tube you can think of and a lot of different 9-pin preamp tubes. And then I have a couple of other prototype amps that I built along the way that I made so that they would give me references of different styles of guitar amplifiers throughout the years. And then as far as guitars, I have Les Pauls, PRS guitars, Stratocasters, Telecasters.
Yeah, you can't have them all, but that's most of what people are going to use.
Actually, I think I do. I'm trying. And then I have a ton of pickups too. So, for my Les Paul, I own Seth Lovers. I own 36th anniversary DiMarzio. I own Antiquities. I have Schecter custom-made pickups. I have a bunch of different pickups I can put in that one Les Paul just to hear what a Les Paul with these different pickups will sound in it, with 350K pots, with 500K pots, with an O2 cap, with an O1 cap, with an 047 cap, all down the line. It's constant experimentation for me. It's constantly looking at what people doing, whether they're still using treble bleed on their volume pots, whether they're taking them off. How will my pedals respond in that circumstance? And so, kind of every day I run a different experiment of some sort, and at 365 days a year, and I don't take days off.
Right.
The last 23 years of making pedals, that's a lot of experiments, and most of them go bad. So, but that's what it is. It's about learning by trying different things.
So that sends you back to the board. It's like, you know what? I gotta tweak this. I gotta tweak this to make it work with this amp, with this guitar.
Making it more versatile. Don't lose what I had before while adding, new things. That's what I'm always looking for, is to try to make pedals that work with a wider range of amplifiers and a wider range of pedals. If I could make a pedal that worked with every amp and every pedal, well, I wouldn't make any more pedals. I would just make that one. That's all anybody would buy. But no one's made that pedal yet. I don't think any of us think that we can, at least not with 3 or 4 knobs and a couple of switches. It would have to be just like endless knobs and switches. It would have to have some tubes, some op amps, some transformers. It would have to have every architecture.
Yeah, basically have a 20 pedals in one kind of thing.
Yeah.
So we just usually I keep these to an hour. We're a little over an hour now, which is fine. So I've been asking all the questions. Is there anything that you want? We still got 44 people in here. Is there anything that you want to sort of let the folks know, stuff that's coming up, how to get a hold of you if they've got questions, or if they, or anything you want people to know about your line of pedals?
Well, I guess at the moment everybody knows kind of the big thing, which is we're somewhere between in the middle or just getting started in the pandemic. And so it changed everything for supply chain, at least in the U.S. at the moment. We're in Pennsylvania. And depending on where I'm getting enclosures from and individual parts from, some people are completely shut down. I mean, there are some websites that you go to where we all buy parts. that currently are, you just can't buy anything from them. As far as getting enclosures, I haven't been able to get enclosures for about 6 months. Now, part of that was because our old supplier of enclosures shut down last year around August, and they had been a poorly run business for a long time. We'd all kind of expected that they would eventually shut down. Mm-hmm. And that left, the people who did offer to sell enclosures that were drilled, powder coated, and had graphics on them, now had everybody standing at their door. The leftover guys that still did it, had a bunch of us pedal builders saying, "Can you make mine? Can you make mine?" So they could name their price, they could name their lead time, and they could take the work that looked the most attractive. And so, a lot of it's working around that. If there wasn't currently the situation there was in Pennsylvania where a lot of businesses are shut, I probably would go. There's a lot of automotive and motorcycle work in York, Pennsylvania. There's a big Harley-Davidson factory. So there's an awful lot of metal workers here and paint and digital graphics and things like that. And so I probably would just take everything around to different individual vendors and restart getting enclosures that way. But as it is, I'm starting to try to get enclosures from another manufacturer who makes pedal products. So I'm hoping that works out really well. The guy that I've been talking to is a nice guy, and everybody knows him who knows pedals. He's well known in the industry. So I'm really hoping that works out. Mm-hmm. We're trying to get things back into production is the main thing that people should know, is that right now you can't get a direct drive. In about another week, you won't be able to get a game changer. I have some tone presses left. In about 2 weeks, you won't be able to get a tone press, other than from dealers who have them in stock.
Right.
That's a matter of looking at my dealer list and seeing who still has stock. But it's all coming back as things kind of reassemble themselves. Because if we're just at the beginning of COVID-19, then people will find ways to be able to produce things safely. And if that means people go to work wearing spacesuits, then we go to work wearing spacesuits. And I imagine, it won't be everybody stays at home for the rest of their life. It'll be people who need to do certain things like work in a small shop will find ways to work safely. And we'll have to figure out, how you educated a decent amount of a workforce to be able to work safely. And, and maybe something wonderful will happen and we'll all be able to work again because, COVID-19 will get bored with us. That would be nice, but, nobody's counting on that right now. So it's all up in the air, but we're all behind the scenes trying to connect the dots again, to put things back together, to find ways to work safely with each other so that we can get enclosures, so that we can get parts, so that we can safely build product and deliver them to people. I mean, at this point, when I ship product out, I handle everything with nitrile gloves. We try to make the process as safe as possible here, even though no one here has symptoms or anything like that.
Well, that brings about an important point that maybe didn't come out earlier, is that all your stuff, you're not shipping that stuff out. You're making that stuff yourself.
Yeah, we do.
It's all the same made stuff. So I think it's important to let people know that you're not just a name on a pedal. You're the guy.
Yeah, there's a total of 3 of us right now. There's me, there's a guy named Britt Steele who does a lot of the assembly, and there's Ronnie Santmeyer, who over the years has done a lot of assembly. He had a really good gig doing sound and recording for the last few years, so he'd been doing less assembly work, but obviously nobody's playing live anymore, so he might be able to do some assembly work here. But yeah, we're trying to assemble all those pieces again. There was another pedal that we didn't get to, which was the tone press compressor. Yeah. And so that's a pretty neat device that I really just wanted to also touch on real quick too. Yeah, it's I guess most people know what parallel compression is, but in 2002, when that came out, there was no such thing as a parallel compressor. The phrase parallel compression was not being used. It wasn't something that existed as far as I know. I needed a marketing term for a compressor that you could blend a dry signal with. Mm. And what's now called parallel compression had been known as New York drum compression or LA drum compression, depending on if you were from LA or New York and were trying to claim credit for it. And it was a technique that studio technicians used, studio engineers, where they would blend a little bit of the clean sound on a bus back with a heavily compressed bus of drums. So you get your drum mix, And then in series with it, you'd patch in a compressor and you'd hard compress that stuff. And then you'd make a multed or duplicated signal of those, of whatever drums you wanted to be more dynamic. And you'd blend them back in behind that compressed signal to add the transients back in.
Right.
It wasn't really being done on guitar. It wasn't really being used on bass much that I know about. It was mainly a drum technique, so the drums wouldn't sound so grabbed by compression and to give them their transients back. And it was just something I got to thinking about one day on a bike ride. I do a lot of biking. And I started thinking, you know, for guitar, that might be a neat thing because it would get rid of that rubbery attack that chases a lot of guys away from compression. Now, sometimes that rubbery attack is the thing that people want. When you play a Telecaster, the highs can really jump out at you. And other than using your tone control, the only other weapon you have if you don't want to start playing distorted is compression, because it limits the top from being able to take off. But I thought, wouldn't that be neat if you could add some sustain, but have the guitar still sound natural, and also kind of have the dynamics a little bit better controlled, so that when you're playing clean, you stay in the mix. You don't jump forward when you hit it hard and fall back when you brush the strings softly with your thumb.
Right.
And so I came up from the bike ride, and I made a real simple compression circuit just so I could hear it, and a blend circuit next to it. And everybody I played it for over the next few days was pretty knocked out by it, what it could do. And so I made a bunch of different candidates for different styles of compression circuits that might work well next to a dry signal. And everybody tended to gravitate towards the one that was based on, of course, like a Ross/Dynacomp style pedal. I had one that was more complex, that was based on a chip made by a company called That Corp, and it could have release and attack and all threshold and a bunch of cool controls like you expected in the studio. But all the guitar players I showed it to were just like, too much, too much, too much. So especially with the new knob that was giving them this parallel signal of dry. So we ended up basing it on like the Dynacomp Ross type of compressor. They were super popular in 2002, and they still are. They're kind of the ubiquitous. They're kind of almost like the tube screamer of compression.
Right.
And so that was a really easy sell, I thought, was to come out with it at an attractive price where you got a really cool Ross clone and you got a booster pedal if you didn't want to use the compression sound at all, because you could use the dry signal by itself, or you could use that parallel compression feature. And I thought, well, there's three different things. I have to be able to win on one of these aspects. And it was really well priced and handmade. And then Guitar Player did a review of it. They gave it an Editor's Pick Award, and they noted how unique it was and that it was a new type of device that we hadn't had before. There hadn't been parallel compressors for guitar, certainly nothing adjustable. And it took off. I could not make enough of them for about 7 years. We were always making just loads and loads of them.
That's awesome. And
then about 7 years into it, the other pedal makers decided they wanted a piece of the pie, and I hadn't. You know, I didn't copyright it. I should have gotten a patent, not a copyright, a patent. And I should have trademarked the name parallel compression, because nobody had trademarked that at the time. But those are just silly things you do when you don't have an extra 10 grand laying around to do all that stuff with a lawyer.
Right. Yeah. Because you see,
everybody started making them. So when you see a dry blend or a mix knob on a compressor, that's all people making, you know, basically tone presses. It doesn't have brands on it. You know, it's turned out to be a big thing in the guitar industry, almost kind of like a common, you know, a really common thing. It's nearly expected when you make a new compressor. So that's a fun thing for me to know that something that I did, even though I don't necessarily get paid for it, or matter of fact, I don't get paid for it when the other guys sell them, that there's something that I added to the vocabulary of how we play with guitar that has become commonplace. And that's a pretty neat thing in the tone press. So when you see that pedal, that's what it means to me. You know? That's
cool, because I mean, my compressor has a blend knob on it. Now I know where it came from. And actually, when you were talking about the boost channel, just before you mentioned that, as a, you know, something you can do with the compressor, Crowbar types in, the tone press works as a great clean boost as well. So
yeah. Well, the first way I used compressors when the 80s were happening was I had a Silver Jubilee Marshall.
Oh yeah.
And I was playing in a rock band, and pre-Slash. And when I needed a little bit more sustain, because there was never enough sustain in the 80s, I would use a Boss CS2 compressor.
Right.
And so that was my boost pedal. And so I knew guys would use that as a boost pedal. It's a common use for, it's kind of a really I like it better than a typical volume boost pedal in a lot of ways, because you can add sustain without necessarily having to hit the front end of the amp harder. And sometimes when you want more sustain, you don't necessarily want to annihilate that first triode in a tube amp. That first triode, if you hit it too hard and you make it break down a little too much, you lose all the distinction. You never can get a tight sound once you've made that first triode break down too much. And so that's something I knew from being a tube guy and making tube amps for years. And so that's also my approach to building pedals, is that I know how the amps are going to work. I know exactly how it's going to influence the response of the amp.
Well, and using a compressor, you're not going to change the EQ, right? Like if we're a tube screamer, will always give you that hump.
Right. And that can be good. I mean, a tube screamer can tighten things up for you. And with a Fender amp that's loud, it can keep the bottom from getting away from you. But with a compressor, you tend to keep the same response that you already have. I mean, the only downside with compressors is they don't selectively amplify, so you tend to get a little bit of extra noise, and you tend to learn to use your volume knob or know when to turn the pedal off to control that.
Yeah, they raise the noise floor quite a bit. Yeah. All right. I'm just looking in the chat to see if there's any last comments. Don says, Guitar Hack, he's referring to your resume on your website. He says it's very impressive.
Thank you.
PJ and the Beard is saying, Guitar Hack, people should watch, I guess he's referring to you, David, your Facebook page. He's going to get bored here soon and start looking through what he has around and can put together. So you're going to start making...
That's true. I have some parts in the shop. I have different enclosures from over the years from different things that we produced that I never finished out the production runs on them. And so you'll probably see things appearing like special runs, unique things on my Facebook page that'll be for sale. So I'm going to have to get pretty creative in the meantime while I'm waiting on my new enclosure. So yeah, you'll see that. Thanks for reminding me.
So if somebody's, I guess you were saying that you obviously you've got the issue with the enclosures and what's going on. So if somebody's interested in getting one of your pedals, the best thing would be just to keep an eye on your web page, maybe your Facebook page as well. Yeah. Could I get one of my mods, Bruce? I think Bruce, you're the last one in here. If you wouldn't mind throwing up the link to David's Facebook page. It's just David Barber, I'm assuming.
My Facebook page, it's Barber Electronics and D Custom.
Barber Electronics and D Custom, if you wouldn't mind throwing up that link. And Don is asking, we'll make this the last question. He's asking if you're a ham operator, ham radio?
No, I'm an internet operator now.
Internet operator. Okay. All right. So we got the Barber Electronics. Okay, that's the website. That's the website. Can we get David's Facebook? If Brian or Bruce can throw that up real quick.
Just look up Barber Electronics on Facebook. You should find it with that.
Oh, there you go. Barber Electronics on Facebook. All right. Well, thanks for doing this, David. Much appreciated.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no worries. Just hang out for a minute. I just want to thank the folks for checking out the show tonight and for all the great questions. And again, there's links to David's website below, and you can check his there's the Facebook link there. Awesome. Thanks, Brian. And I want to thank everybody for checking out the show. Much appreciated. I posted a video earlier today, my hack guitar of the day, if you guys wouldn't mind checking that out. And on Saturday, I am going to be doing another group chat. It's probably going to be on DR's guitar channel, so check that out, and that should be a lot of fun. But I'll put that into my in the community tab for you to check that out. Love you too, Quentin. All right, okay. So thanks, Dave, for doing this. Thanks everybody for checking out the show, and have a great rest of your weekend, folks. And cheers. We'll see you soon.
Thanks.